Hello. In this lecture, we will look at art from between the world wars, and this will be the first of two lectures that deals with this time period. We'll focus on art from about 1920-21 up through the beginning, ultimately, of World War II, but just the precursor period to that. And we're going to look at three specific movements during this lecture. We're going to look at social statement, new objectivity, and then surrealism. There will be a follow-up to this that'll be called Art Between the Wars 2 that'll look at a couple of other movements that were important from this time period. This was a very turbulent time. In the aftermath of World War I, especially as Europe was struggling with Reconstruction and struggling with moving into a new age of technology, a new age of the spread and proliferation of some political ideologies that were kind of changing the landscape of culture in Europe. And at the same time, you have the rise in the couple of generations after World War I, you have the rise of America as a much more important cultural force. And so, Europe is struggling in the aftermath of the war to figure out exactly what its identity is going to be and how culture is going to fit into that. Now, because World War I was such an important and life-changing event for so many people all over the world, it makes sense that at least part of the response to that culture would bring in the first generation after the war would deal with some of the legacies of war. Some of those being physical, some more emotional, some psychological, some intellectual. And I think that art has always been, in many ways, a response to what's happening culturally in previous generations, and also a response to what's happening socially. And so, there's times when art leads society, but it's always a reflection of what's happening in our world. Now, there was a group of artists who had established themselves in the early 1920s, some even prior to that, as using their art as a vehicle to make a social or political statement through aesthetic expression. Now, these artists were not as tightly knit in a group as other movements, but they definitely all had a common goal. One of the most important and prolific of these artists was Pablo Picasso. Picasso had established himself in the generation before, really, at the turn of the 20th century, as an important young artist on the scene in Paris. But he was native to Spain, and he never, even though he moved around, he never forgot those roots in Spain, and he was proud to be Spanish. Now, what I think makes Picasso so interesting and different than other artists was his willingness to experiment and his willingness to take risks, perhaps, that a different artist of a different personality and identity wouldn't take. He didn't mind offending others. He didn't mind taking the risk of alienating his viewer. He wanted to make sure that the viewer understood what he was thinking and feeling and communicating, even if the viewer doesn't quite understand every detail or every aspect, or if he doesn't communicate those sentiments realistically. Picasso was an abstract artist, and so his style very often was not. The goal is not realism, and the goal is not to be as sort of obvious or surface driven with the meaning. He wants the viewer to really have to think about what they're seeing and what it might represent or mean, and how it connects to what's happening in society today. So this is one of the seminal works of this period by Picasso. It's called Guernica, and it was made in direct response to an event that happened, the bombing of a small village in Spain that was really the center point for the dissidents against the Spanish government. Franco was the fascist dictator, and Italy had a fascist dictator as well in Mussolini. And so those two conspired to try and put down a more democratic rebellion that was taking place in provinces within Spain. And so the Italian Air Force, which was a new thing, air forces, air travel, but of course air warfare, was something that had come in at the tail end of World War I and was getting more and more sophisticated as the years went on. The newer planes could fly higher, out of range of ground military forces, and it allowed them to basically bomb any target, really ultimately, initially, without the threat of recourse by the troops on the ground. And so, especially if those troops didn't have the most modern and up-to-date weaponry that was available. So Franco was facing a challenge, like I said, from within his own country to his authority, and he met that challenge by asking and inviting his counterpart from Italy, Mussolini, to bring his air force to Spain and bomb their own people. So the village of Guernica had a little over 3,000 people in it, and many of those people were separatists, or at least dissidents to the Spanish government, the fascist dictator. And so he was basically Franco was the Italian Air Force to try and just squash this uprising and defeat his political enemies. When Picasso heard about what had happened, he was, of course, like many, outraged and upset and, and fearful for what was happening in his home country. As an artist, he wanted to respond in a way that made the most sense to him. He could make a statement, not just with words, but with images. And so this is a large-scale, extraordinarily large-scale, monumental work. It's a very, very large mural. And while it might seem to be a little broken and disjointed, when you examine each piece and you kind of try and read the image, it makes sense as to what he's referencing. So we start at the far left of the panel, and we see a woman holding a child, looks to be dead, certainly head thrown back, and her head's thrown back in anguish, and she sort of looks up to the heavens and screams and cries in anguish. And standing over her is a bull. Now, the stylization here is clearly abstraction, but it's not, again, remember the goal is to communicate the feeling, the idea of what's happening, but how chaotic it is and how misunderstood it all is and how it doesn't make sense. And so I think Picasso is choosing to work in a style that matches his response. It doesn't make sense to him. He's not going to paint it realistically. The bull is a symbol for the Italians, for Mussolini, and his government and his air force coming to bomb these people, and the anguish that the people feel over the loss of life. As we move to the right, in the center of the panel, we see a soldier, broken sword in his hand, fallen from his horse, and so that kind of symbolizes and represents those Spanish dissidents who gave their lives in search of freedom. Now, above them is this kind of dual image of a light, an electric light, which was relatively new for the time, and then it resembles very much an eye, and that's on purpose, of course. So seeing, illuminating, giving light to the situation, I think, is what he's trying to represent there. Now, as we move to the right half, or at least third of the panel, we see three other figures, all of which who offer a typical human response to tragedy or to events like these. The figure in the upper left reaches in with the arm holding the lamp, the face, the mouth open and kind of aghast, and observing, but also with that, by reaching in and holding that light, giving light to or illuminating the situation, trying to not only see what's happening, but show others and share with others what's happening. The figure just below that one looks as it's posed as if it's sort of lunging forward or reaching forward, trying to offer help or assistance or aid to the fallen soldier. And then at the extreme right, a figure that bookends and kind of the figure of the mother and child, and this figure throws their arms up in pain, but also in just an overwhelming sense of grief and what's happening. And each of these figures represents sort of the different typical human responses to events like Guernica. And I think what Picasso is trying to do in this work is to use his style, to use his techniques and his imagery to do that, to offer just another take on the truth and what's happening. You'll also notice, and I think it's important, this is quite common for some artists in response to war, that he limits his palette. We don't see hardly any color at all. It's almost all just blacks, whites, and grays and values. And that's very typical of artists who are influenced by war. War tends to push us towards the black and white, the good and wrong, the allies and the axis of evil. And so, this was the atmosphere in Europe of what was happening in the time. And this is all coming fresh on the heels of World War I. And so the people were very nervous and scared that figures like Mussolini, like Franco, like Hitler, that they were coming to power in places that were ever expanding their military presence all throughout Europe, places that were strategically aligning themselves with each other towards what ends no one really knew, but it created this atmosphere of fear and trepidation in Europe, which actually pushed a lot of artists, rather than to stay and to add to the social debate or to try and weigh in on things, they just escaped. They fled Europe and ended up in New York, many of them. So between the tail end of World War I and the build up to World War II, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of artist emigres who leave Europe. They leave Germany, they leave France, they leave England, and come to the United States to find a place where they can express themselves more freely. Picasso, throughout his long career, even though he went through many phases and styles of his aesthetics, he always kept an edge of social activism. He was never afraid to shine a light on the truth, to bring attention and notice to things, whether it be in Europe or other places. So this is a work that's inspired by the buildup in Southeast Asia, specifically in China and Korea, as to what's happening to the people there as communism and other kind of more radically different to Western ideas, to the ideas of democracy and capitalism, that they, as these in places around the world where these ideologies are becoming more popular and taking over, oftentimes it's at the direct or results in the direct loss of freedoms and very often the loss of lives of the people to whom these governments see as enemies. Now, Picasso, it always has his own style. He tended to favor outline. He tended to favor simplicity of mark making. He tended to, find within the form of a figure, the essence of the shape of that figure. And I think that shape is very important in Picasso's style all throughout his life, but especially in the 1920s and 30s and on into the early 40s. Now, as kind of a counterbalance to the style of Picasso, we see an artist working in a much more traditional, realistic vein, a man by the name of Diego Rivera. Rivera was a Mexican artist who left Mexico in the early 1900s or 1900s, 19-teens, traveled and studied in Paris, studied all over Europe, especially Italy, and he brought back to Mexico with him in the 1920s ideas about politics and religion and war and seeing the direct effects of all of these on man in general, but also on what was happening in society in Europe and how that was playing out all over the world. Just because Europe was sort of the center, that doesn't mean that places farther afield were not affected. Mexico went through its own revolution. Mexico went through its own, growing pains in the first half of the 20th century. And so Rivera really struggled to find a way to represent himself as an artist of the world, but also as a Mexican and what that meant and what was how their history fit into that. Mexico being a colony, we tend to kind of forget that just like India and Africa and Asia were all colonies. South America, Central America, Latin America, these were all colonies as well. They had a legacy of hundreds of years at this point of both social, political, and economic colonization by Europe. And unlike other places that had struggled to kind of cast off those bounds, Mexico fought a war, of course, and a revolution, but had also continued to struggle to find its identity because there's these two legacies. There's the legacy of the Spanish and there's the legacy of the native indigenous peoples to Mexico. And there was definitely a class divide in that first half of the 20th century. Now, Rivera, though, even though he was Mexican, he saw himself as a man of the world. He was very well traveled, very well read, and very influenced by what he saw all over the world. And what he saw at its heart was that man was seeking to understand and know the world through science, through medicine, through religion, through politics. All of these really at their heart are an attempt to understand what's happening in the world and find man's place in it. Now, Rivera was a muralist and he was a fresco painter. So he paints by painting into wet plaster with dry pigments mixed with slurry and lime and water. And this is a very old technique. It had kind of fallen out of fashion with the invention of oil paint, but Rivera insists that it's the most, public of art forms. And it actually was quite popular in the 20s and 30s in public places, in both places that were government owned or just in, places that were public, but they were privately owned. So companies' headquarters that were important places, or government buildings, or schools, or these were places in the late 20s, especially as we move into the Depression era in America, Central America, South America, where artists are finding work and finding commissions and patronage. Now, symbolically, what we see here is this idea of man at the center, surrounded by all the different fields of science, but especially one of the newer fields, the study of the atom, the study of the infinitesimally small, the microscopically small. It's centered over by this giant microscope, and there's cogs in the wheel, so to speak. And really what we see here is a form, a shape that represents the atom with man at the center of it. And as it's surrounded by all of those belief systems which have driven us, whether they be social, political, or religious, or ideological, and that we fight wars to enforce our beliefs on others or to negate the beliefs of others. And that there were, World War I was not just about one, one movement, one ideological thought. World War I had a lot of implications in society. And one of the most important culturally is, what is the nature of man's aesthetic as it relates to expression, and what's that really for? For centuries, art had struggled to find an acceptable outlet for these types of questions, other than religion. So for what we have for quite a long time is a religious dominated subject matter. But now artists are going to really question the nature of man's relationship with each other, with God, with the natural world, and all of this is changing very, very quickly. It's an important time for what's happening in the world. Now, at the same time, for Rivera personally, he's struggling with what it means to be Mexican. Because the native people of Mexico, especially the province of Oaxaca where he's from, these are people who are poor for the most part, the people who are sort of the lower social and economic classes in Mexico. The flower vendors, the street hawkers, the people who do the jobs that others don't want. And these are people who he associates with, and he finds the beauty in this and the nobility in these subjects. His work tends to be more on the realistic side, especially as it compares to somebody like Picasso, but that doesn't mean that it's not stylized. And we see there's certain elements of realism. There's certain kind of a nod to modeling, a nod to the lights and darks and shades and shadows. But the idea is very direct and almost illustrative. He wants to make sure that you see, understand quickly the subject matter, and then can move on to its meaning, what it's trying to communicate. That life for these individuals is difficult, and that they have occupations and jobs that are only going to provide, a meager existence. These are not the people who are going to lead, the people who are allowed to lead. And that's a big theme as we look at social justice and injustice. And artists of this period really want to explore what it means to have social justice. Now, in Germany in particular, or I should say with German artists in particular, there's a more direct backlash to World War I. These artists are trying to take an objective look at what it means culturally to be German in a time period when Germans were seen as the villains of the war. And after that, even though people like Max Beckmann and Otto Dix, they don't have any direct culpability in the war, they're struggling to try and relate with a society that's becoming more and more standoffish, certainly hostile at times to Germans, especially in Paris. Paris society, after the war, in the 1920s in particular, was the first part of the decade especially, was a kind of a social explosion of excess, I mean, there's just vast wealth that's flowing around Europe and America, and these newly wealthy individuals are expressing themselves by these grand, almost palaces. These are the new nobility, the economic nobility. These are the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the vast fortunes being made in the first quarter of the century. J.P. Morgan in New York is sort of a very, a great example of these attitudes. And so they express themselves culturally, and Germans in response, because they're seen as sort of the villains of the story of World War I, in that 10 to 20 years after, it's hard to find a place. You can see here at the center, Beckmann paints this self-portrait of the artist surrounded by Parisian society, but you can see that he doesn't engage. They don't talk to him. They seem aloof. It seems kind of dark, and it's not a happy, joyous, celebratory scene. And I think for artists like Beckmann, the only option to deal with the aftermath of the war was try and look at it objectively. So do you feel a culpability as an artist, as a German? Do you find a way to deal with that, to express remorse, or to express regret, or to acknowledge that while your country or race perhaps is associated with the war, that doesn't mean that you are as an individual, or that Germans collectively of today or their day are responsible for what happened in the past. But they definitely felt, and Beckmann himself writes about feeling responsible, or at least being made to feel responsible and apologetic. Beckmann also, most of his works tend to be very autobiographical, or many of them do. And in his works, he deals with that, through that autobiographical nature, he deals with kind of what it's like to grow up, or what it was like to grow up in a Germany that was moving towards war, and then eventually dealing with the war, and then moving away from the war, and how to respond after. So this is a triptych of kind of an autobiographical triptych. That's him in the center on the rocking horse, and his mother was a socialite, and his father was kind of aloof and really not really engaged with him. So neither of his parents kind of spent much time with him, even though he had kind of this charmed life and upbringing. Then on the right, the panel that represents kind of school, and how there was a right way and a wrong way to do it, and he always seemed to kind of end up on the wrong side of the debate of the thinking. And then dealing with the war. So the panel on the left, and he stands at the window, and the air raids and the gas masks, and it was a lot of change that happened. World War I was called the war to end all wars because they couldn't fathom at the time, by World War II and beyond, we would change our attitudes towards these things, but they couldn't fathom at the time a conflict being more devastating, being more heinous and horrific than World War I. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men killed, culture destroyed, buildings just leveled, and the idea is that as an artist, when you're experiencing that, and people look at, well, you're German, and that means that they were the ones who are responsible for the war. That's going to weigh upon the rest of their lives. And then after the war, what do you do? How do you overcome? And so artists like Beckmann, like Otto Dix, what they're trying to do is to show the truth, this objective truth about the nature of man, about the nature of war, about what the war was really like, that it was very personal, that it was, these aren't just numbers, these are people. And even when they remain faceless, and, what we end up seeing is these dark images of the horrors of war, because that for them was the reality. This wasn't a war that was fought kind of, by gentlemen. This wasn't a conflict that was fought in some distant land for them. For them, this was very real and very much personal and in their, in their immediate past. And so it had to be dealt with. You notice, again, like Picasso, lots of blacks, whites, and grays, very little color. It's a very dark imagery. But then as we move beyond into these next phase of art, we're going to see sort of the color and vitality of life return. This is Dix's most famous image, or one of his most famous images from the period, and it's called the Skat Players, and they're playing this card game that was very, very popular at the time. And these are all veterans of the war, and you can see that they all have missing body parts and limbs. They all have mechanical replacements. They have adapted to life after the war, but you can also see how, this would not definitely would not have been how they would choose to live. But, it is the reality. And so as such, you can't hide from it. And Dix chooses to focus on the truth of what it's like for these folks. Now, surrealism is yet another response to the war, but in a very different way. Surrealist art tries to remove the reality. It's surreal. And so it's not real, and yet it deals with a lot of the same elements of the real. It tries to touch upon something below reality, something that is kind of an alternate way of thinking about reality, much more like a fantasy or a dream or something that is in the mind but not necessarily in the world. So the surrealists, they think, the idea is that the only real response to war, you can't make sense of it. You can't rationalize it. You can't dramatize it. It is a terrible, terrible thing. And the only way to try and make sense of it is to not try and make sense of it. To see that the world, because of humanity, is flawed, and, in order to find a different way of making images, what you have to look for is a different source, because reality is just too depressing, too dark. Salvador Dali is the leader of the surrealists, and he actually doesn't come from nowhere. And even before the war, there was a group of artists who were kind of moving towards this type of image making, this type of art. And they were centered mostly in Paris. Artists like Marcel Duchamp and his absurdity, Dada artists in both Germany and Paris, and the expressionism that marked some of the early German art movements before the war. But after the war, it just became harder and harder to connect to anything rational. And that's ultimately what surrealism does, is that it says the irrational oftentimes can be a haven when reality becomes just too overwhelming, too dark. So Dali, this is one of his most famous works. It's called The Persistence of Memory. And when you try and examine it in the way that you would another painting, a more realist painting, there's certain parts that seem to make sense. You know, that looks like a tree, that looks like a clock, a watch, those look like ants, it looks like a landscape. We're not really sure if that's supposed to be a horse or a face or an eye or an ear or what is that thing. And that's sort of the point. You're not supposed to look at it and say, oh, I get it. It's, here's the story, here's the image. What you're supposed to do is just take it in for what it's worth exactly, and then try not to make rational sense of it, but just understand that what we're seeing is not rational. What we're seeing is completely irrational, and yet interesting and effective in still communicating an aesthetic or a style or a beauty or whatever that might be. Now, Dali, he enjoyed, like Duchamp, his predecessor, he enjoyed sort of playing and toying with the viewer. He wanted us to look at the work and have just enough to kind of capture our imagination, and yet not enough to actually figure out what's happening. I think where Dali and the other surrealists, where they were successful is in making an art that didn't have to be something other than it was. It didn't have to be something narrative. It didn't have to tell a story. It didn't have to be something figurative or literal or philosophical or allegorical or any of those things that art, the roles that art had played for thousands of years at this point. Now, and in that way, they were quite innovative because, it's hard to do something new. It's difficult to change. We don't like it. We would prefer things to just stay the same. And if you can make a pretty picture that makes sense, then why not make that? Why would you rather make something like this that doesn't make hardly any sense? Well, but the answer, I suppose, lies in the world. They look at the world and say, these are things that don't make sense. There's so much around us, that so much of humanity doesn't make sense. Why should art make sense when it doesn't? I think what makes Dali and the other surrealists effective is that they don't think about the viewer first. They don't think about the collector. They don't think about the patron. They don't think about the gallery and ultimately the museum. They're not trying to create something that reflects or responds to previous influences, at least not strongly. They're not trying to create something that's historical. They're simply making an art that is in the moment of their time and reflecting that. Now, understanding, they know that there are going to be some who will be put off by their style. They know and accept that there are going to be some who refuse to allow even that what they're making is art. But they're willing to accept that. They're willing to say, okay, if I alienate with my style, then I'm successful in one thing. I have definitely affected the viewer. I have definitely asked a question, perhaps, that made us uncomfortable. Why is this not an acceptable form of expression if we don't believe that it is? And I think that at the heart of surrealism is a question more so than an answer. It's not trying to offer, it's trying to engage the viewer in more of a dialogue. I'll ask a question, and then how you respond should tell you something about me, and it tells you something about you. Sometimes surrealism on its surface can be easily dismissed. I think the biggest mistake that viewers and those who don't appreciate what the surrealists were doing completely, the biggest mistake that's made is that they only go so far in trying to understand it. Now, this is an art form that requires a lot of the viewer. You have to engage. You have to try and ask yourself, why? Why would they make this decision? Why would they show us this? Why would they give us this? Why would they offer this as a question or as a form of communication, which is what all art is? And it's in that why where we discover, the viewers discover, the truth that the artists are trying to communicate. This is Merit Oppenheim, and she was a sculptor and an artist in various media and form, and she made this piece. It's colloquially known as the fur teacup, but she wasn't nearly as literal in her intention. So basically what we're looking at here is a relatively simple object. Not one that she's made, it's an object that she's assembled, I suppose is the best word. So it's a teacup and saucer, a porcelain, very simple, very common object, a very functional object. And then a silver spoon, and all of those three objects have been covered with fur. Now, okay, on the surface, it seems ridiculous. Why would you cover a teacup in fur? But that's the question that she wants you to ask. Why would you cover a teacup in fur? So what you have to do is think about, okay, well, what is a teacup? What's its purpose? To drink tea. Well, why would we cover it in fur? What does it do to it? You can't drink tea out of it. So if it can't drink tea out of it, then what does it become? It becomes a less functional object. But does destroying its function destroy its worth or value? Those two different things. Something that's worth money, that is very valuable, but we value things that aren't always that are worth a lot of money. And we sometimes don't value things that are worth a lot of money. And sometimes there's contradictions like we see here. We associate fur with wealth. The wealthy wear fur. Fur is expensive. So fur is an image of wealth and luxury because only the wealthy can afford to wear furs. And fur was quite popular in the 19-teens, 20s, and into the 30s. If you were wealthy enough, you bought a fur coat, and that was seen as a luxury. So you have this material that is itself seen as a luxury. And then you have a very utilitarian object. Now, it would seem you put those two together, and our rational minds would argue that you're making the functional object more valuable. If this were made from gold, we would be more impressed. We would say, wow, that's a lot of gold. It's worth a lot of money. That person must be rich and wealthy. But because it's not gold, because it's another valuable material that is expensive but doesn't fit, then that's when we say it seems ridiculous. Because by covering it in fur, it does the exact opposite of what covering something in fur would normally do. It destroys its value. It is worthless. As a teacup, you can't drink tea out of it. You wouldn't anyway. You wouldn't want to. So why do it? Well, there is no rational answer. So, and I think that the question, though, that's inherent in that is that does man do very often things that are irrational in the name of luxury and wealth? Things that are unnecessary, things that actually do damage to the consumption, that do damage to the wealth, that do damage to us as individuals. We get so obsessed with objects and the material that we would destroy the purpose for objects by embellishing them. And I think that that's what Oppenheim was trying to say. And that's what the Surrealists are trying to say, is that the world doesn't make as much rational sense as we would like it to. Prior to the time period of the 1920s, there's been 2,500, almost 3,000 years of classical thought that said man is the measure of all things. Human rational thought is at the center of our understanding, and it's at the center of all things in the universe, that man is that center. And if given enough time and opportunity, we can figure just about anything out. We're so rational. And the Surrealists would say, we're not nearly as rational as we think we are. We're not nearly as reasonable as we think we are. Very often we are irrational, and very often we tend towards things that don't make sense. We express ourselves in ways that are absurd, like the fur teacup. So it concludes the first half of the Art Between the Wars, and we'll look at the second half in the next lecture.